We're going to talk about nutrient programs for hydroponic crops. My name is Rosa Raudales. I am assistant professor and greenhouse extension specialist at the University of Connecticut. I speak Spanish, so I also do a lot of training for Spanish-speaking population, so feel free to contact me in either language. So let's start with our topic of the day. So when we think about nutrition, we always need to keep in mind that we want to provide all the essential nutrients that the plants requires. So I'm not going to go and read all these elements, but we know that we need to provide all of them. So for those of you who are thinking about tailoring and refining your nutrition programs down to the penny, you want to make sure that you cover all those nutrients and provide them to the plant. The other thing when we think about nutrition is providing the right concentration at the right time. The way we think about it is you develop a nutrient solution, you have your targets based on the crop's needs, and you provide those, but you also want to make sure that those nutrients are uptaken by the plant. And you want to make sure that, again, those are used in the appropriate form. So just here, I'm going to point at the photo. We have some photos of calcium deficiency or boron deficiency in the roots here. And this is something that Neil Matson did, and it's in one of the e-Gro alerts under the research bulletin, okay? So one of the most important things when we think about nutrition is how we manage pH. And pH is very important because it determines the nutrient solubility. So if you look at the graph here on the right, you'll see that on the x-axis, we have the pH gradient from 4.5 to 7.5. And then we have listed some of our essential elements. When we put attention to the micronutrients, you can see that when the pH is high, the micronutrients become less available. So it doesn't mean that the micronutrients are disappearing. It's just that they're in a form that are less available for the plant. Likewise, when the pH is too high, the nutrients become more available. So in cases where we're growing crops that are sensitive to excessive micronutrients, we might see that. In hydroponics, we don't have a lot of crops that are sensitive to excess levels of micronutrients. So you want to keep that in a level that's a little bit on the low side, right? So again, the main goal is to keep plant health, to avoid excessive levels of nutrients or insufficient levels of nutrients. So today we're going to talk about the goals of nutrient programs. And one of the things is, first, we want to provide all the essential elements. So we want to make sure that whichever nutrient solution we pick has all those elements present. We want to make sure that we're providing the right quantity of nutrients. And then we want to make sure that everything that we do is going to enhance the availability and uptake. So what you're seeing in the photo is a terrible and sad root. So you can see that even though we might have everything for the plants and the nutrient solution to be okay, if we don't take care of other aspects of plant health, then the nutrient program doesn't work very well either. So it's really an integral approach that we want to take. So today we're going to talk first about water quality. We're going to cover some nutrient programs, and we're going to talk about how to do pH management in hydroponics. So the first question I always ask my growers, and I would like to hear answers from you on the chat box, is when was the last time you tested your water? I always ask this and I get very few hands up. So hopefully all of you are going to say last year, the year before that, last month, sometime. So one of the things I would like to encourage you to go ahead, test your water, and send me your results. I will be very glad to help you make interpretations of what those results mean and how you might need to adjust your nutrient program based on those, okay? So start with that. We always want to start with knowing what's in the water quality. So the first aspect we look in water quality is the water alkalinity. And water alkalinity refers to the neutralizing capacity of a solution. The easiest way to think about water alkalinity is to think about dissolved limestone, right? So if we have a lot of dissolved limestone, that means that when we're trying to drop the pH, there's something that will buffer and take that pH up. So to visualize this in an easier way, what we have in this graph, on the x-axis, you will see the volume in sulfuric acid. So it goes in milliliters from 0 to 7. And then on the y-axis, we have water pH. So if you look at the red line to begin with, you see that if I add 1 milliliter, the red line is high alkalinity. You see that if I add 1 milliliter, the pH drops very little. if I add 2, and so on, it goes dropping in a very gradual way. So I need up to almost 7 milliliters of sulfuric acid to drop the pH down to 4.5. So once the solution reaches a pH of 4.5, we can say that the alkalinity has been neutralized. So if we compare that to the green line, which is water with low alkalinity, you can see that if I add just a little bit under 2 milliliters of sulfuric acid, the pH drops very dramatically, right? So you can see if you're trying to adjust the pH of your nutrient solution, you want to start by knowing, do I have a lot of alkalinity or not, right? Why is it that it's harder for me to drop the pH? Or why is it that I just add a very little and it drops very quickly? So the way we want to manage alkalinity is in hydroponics, the first thing we need to think about is first we want to acidify, and that's when you're creating a new batch of nutrient solution. That has to be your first tool to think about. When you're thinking about management, you want to think about using fertilizers higher in ammonium. And using ammonium fertilizers, it's not a very common practice in hydroponics, but I do know some of the best growers that we have here in Connecticut, which are using ammonium as they go in their production cycle to manage their pH. And we'll talk about that when we talk about pH management. If you have a very low alkalinity, you might want to add a little bit, because you want to have a little bit of buffer in case some things go unexpected. So, and we're going to talk about levels as well. The potential side effects of adjusting alkalinity are that you're probably adding a little of other elements. When we talk about ammonium fertilizers, and that's the reason a lot of growers don't use it, because there's a potential for toxicity, is that, again, if you overdo it, you're crossing a line that's a little bit dangerous. And then again, when you're using bases, you can see that again, you're adding either potassium or sodium. And we'll talk more about this further. So a big question most growers ask is, how much acid should I add to lower the alkalinity? So our colleagues at the University of New Hampshire did a very good job and make that very easy for us. So if you go to the link that's at the bottom, and you will find this tool that they developed where you can enter the information about what's the pH of your sample, what's the alkalinity, and what's your target, either alkalinity or pH. So again, you want to make an informed decision, and you can't use the tool unless you have the information about alkalinity, right? So you want to start by knowing that information. The thing that you want to keep in mind, in case you were yesterday listening to Brian, this is a slightly different concept than the way we think about container production, right? Because once you neutralize the alkalinity in your nutrient solution, the alkalinity is not going to go back up, right? So once you deal with that, you kind of forget about it. So it's something you think about when you're starting a fresh batch of nutrient solution. In container production, we constantly think about it because we're adding it every time we irrigate, because we're kind of adding a new batch of water every time. So just keep those things in mind, that it's slightly different when we talk about alkalinity in container production. The other nice thing about this tool is that it gives you not only the amount of the different acids you can apply, it gives you options for the acids. If you look at the top tabs, it will give you a cost comparison, and it will also give you a little bit of information and safety. So very nice tool, highly recommend it. The other aspect on water quality is electrical conductivity. So we all know electrical conductivity is a measurement of the ability of solutions to move electrical charges. Why it matters to us is because it's an indicator of the total concentration of salts in the solution. There are many ions that are present in the water, in water sources, that contribute to this electrical conductivity. So the rule of thumb is, if your electrical conductivity is greater than 0.5 millisiemens per centimeter, it requires further analysis, because you do want to pinpoint whether that electrical conductivity comes from calcium, comes from sodium, comes from chloride, because different management strategies will be required depending on what's contributing to a high electrical conductivity. Many growers have the luxury to use reverse osmosis when they start their hydroponic solutions, so they really don't have to take care much about what I'm saying now, but they do have to take care of the treatment aspect. So when you get a complete nutrient analysis, like I said, if you get over 0.5 millisiemens per centimeter, you want to keep an eye on what are the elements. Your target is that Sodium should be under 50, chloride under 70, sulfites under 90, boron under 0.5, fluoride under 1. You also want to keep an eye on calcium levels. Even though the ideal is to have a lower calcium because it gives you more flexibility in the fertilizers, you can also adjust based on the fertilizers that you have. So in summary, water quality is very important. The first thing you want to look is at the water alkalinity. And just a reminder, it's the pH buffering capacity of the water. You need to adjust it when you're preparing a new batch of the nutrient solution. The water electrical conductivity will tell us about the total amount of salts. You want to know which salts are contributing to electrical conductivity, especially if you have high electrical conductivity. And then information is power, so make sure you have a complete water analysis and use it to determine fertilizer rates and management options. Even if you think you have good water, I think there's no reason why you shouldn't get an analysis. The analyses aren't that expensive. You can get one for $40. You don't need to be doing them too often. Once a year would be a good rule of thumb. So with that, we're gonna move to more specifics on nutrient recipes. First, we're gonna talk about lettuce and leafy greens, and then we're gonna talk about tomatoes and vine crops. So if we look here, we have on that green row, we have the different options that are the most commonly used fertilizers for production of lettuce and leafy greens. All of them are very good and all of them will work, right? One of the things we need to pay attention is with the one bag system, the first column, you can see that the calcium's on the low side. I tested it in my greenhouse and we grew lettuce. The lettuce grew very well. So it does work, but the two bag system seems to provide a little bit faster growth, and it also seems that, especially for lettuce, the two bag system gives you a greener crop. But with that said, the one bag system, it's one that's very easy to work with. It's very good. It works very well with herbs. So if you're starting to get in hydroponics, you want to keep it simple. It's an option, right? There's a 3-bag system. Again, when we look at the numbers are relatively similar. The difference is that it has a 3rd bag, which is magnesium sulfate. If you look at the concentration of magnesium, there's not much difference among it. The good and the benefit of this would be if you have a water quality that has high magnesium levels, then you have a way to control by using this combination of the magnesium sulfate as a separate nutrient. And then the Sonneveld solution is one that you provide the elements individually, and you can see that you can adjust all the elements one at a time. So again, that gives you much more power, but it also increases in complexity and whether you want to be managing all those elements individually. One of the things to keep in mind when you're mixing your salts is that you want to avoid mixing calcium nitrate and potassium sulfate because calcium will react with phosphorus and calcium will also react with sulfate and it will form solid precipitates that become insoluble, right? This is only true if you have a concentrated solution. If you have a solution that's diluted, then you could have them all in a single tank, right? But otherwise, again, if you have a concentrated solution and you have injectors that are going to be going through the line, make sure the calcium is always separate from the rest of the elements. The Sonneveld solution is another, the one I mentioned earlier where you apply all the elements individually. This is a reference I got from our colleague Neil Madsen, who's also an e-Gro member. And you can see the exact rates that they recommend and how they combine the different tanks. You can see the calcium's on one side and again, avoiding to have it with elements where they can precipitate. So here are just a couple of photos. You can see this is from a greenhouse in the Netherlands. You can see 2 tanks are the gold standard. If you want to go into a really extremely sophisticated system, you can have injectors for all the individual elements. So the little colors you see at the bottom on that pipe, each of them has an injector that's going to be pulling individual nutrients. But that's a complexity that might not be necessary for most people. So one of the things is how much nutrient do we apply? So again, this comes from Neil Matson's reference, and you can see that the recommendations are pretty standard. If you're growing many herbs and lettuce, you can pretty much use about the same nutrient levels. So the numbers we're seeing at here are parts per million of nitrogen. You can see in propagation, you have lower numbers, and during production, you raise those levels a bit. So how do you estimate how much fertilizer to add? If you go to the label, this is the 5-11-26, which is kind of a gold standard in hydroponics. You can see how much nitrogen we have there. You can see that's gonna tell you if you add X amount, it gives you 50 parts per million. But the way we monitor how much we're putting is usually through measuring electrical conductivity. Very few growers are measuring the actual nitrogen in the solution. So make sure that you know what the conversion is. And in addition to that, you need to remember that your water will also be providing some electrical conductivity. So you will have to account for that as your final electrical conductivity. This is an example from how Basil responds to different electrical conductivity rates. So this is research that was done by, again, one of our e-Gro colleagues, Chris Curry. And what you can see is that he tested electrical conductivities that go from 0.5 all the way to 4. And then he measured fresh weight of the crop, and that's what the numbers you see at the bottom. And what he found out is that it didn't matter if you were applying 0.5 to 4, the basil grew really well. So the take-home message here is more is not necessarily better, because more fertilizer, it's more money that you're putting into your crop. And even though you're seeing some differences in the actual numbers, what Chris said in his research is we see slightly differences, but we didn't see any statistical difference. So pretty much they grow the same. So if you can avoid over-applying fertilizers, keep that in mind. Then the other thing to keep in mind is the optimum pH. pH is extremely important for lettuce and herbs. And here you can see that if your intention is to grow multiple crops and you're using the same tank, which is a common practice that we've seen in the industry, you want to keep it within a range where most of your crops will grow well. So something around 5.8 to 6 is a good target. I would say on the lower end, crops tend to grow a little bit better. The consideration here is that if you're growing a single crop, you want to keep your pH as tight as possible. If you have multiple crops, you can have a little bit more of a range to make sure that you're satisfying more crops. The other thing is the optimum pH is also very dependent on the cultivars. So again, check with your seed catalogs and seed providers to make sure that you're delivering the target pH for your specific cultivars. One of the things that's very interesting about pH and electrical conductivity is that what we've seen, and this is research from Cornell University, what they saw here is that the blue bar is that they grew lettuce at pH 5.4. The green bar, they grew lettuce at pH 6.0, and then they measured the fresh weight. So you can see that when the pH was 5.4, the average weight was 132 grams. So if the pH was left on the higher end, you can see that the lettuce was much smaller, so 24% difference. If we compare that to the impact of electrical conductivity, they also tested on the blue bar a lower electrical conductivity, 1.4, a higher electrical conductivity, 1.8, and they didn't see any difference between the fresh weight. Very similar to what Chris saw, he didn't see any difference in the weight by looking at the electrical conductivity. So again, pH is a very strong determinant of the growth rate and the final weight for your crops. So just to summarize, choose your fertilizer program that best fits your practices. There are options, so you can pick based on what fits for you. The 2-bag system or Sonnevelds provide optimal level of nutrients, and you have a little bit better control, especially by separating the calcium if you have a stock solution and you have higher levels of calcium. And you can also adjust the calcium level if your water were to have higher calcium levels. The 3-bag system is optimum for water sources high in magnesium, but other than that, there's not a lot of benefit on adding a third bag, right? And then the one bag is simple and easy to use. It's a bit low on calcium. I would say the one bag is a very, very good option for growing herbs. And then finally, match your fertilizer rates to get to the right electrical conductivity. Make sure you don't overdo it, and make sure you're really staying on top of that pH. And that's why we're going to talk about pH management shortly. So now we're going to talk about pH. So we know that there are several factors that affect pH: plant genetics, root respiration, and nitrogen form. We have some tools that we're going to talk about. We have acids, bases, and we have fertilizers. So the first thing is to understand a little bit how and why the pH of the nutrient solutions tend to drop. So what you see in this image is a root. You can see that plants use oxygen through the roots, and they expel CO2. This CO2 reacts with the water in the nutrient solution, and they form carbonic acid. So the pH tends to drop down. So this is an important factor, especially when you're seeing those very warm days when the plants are respiring very fast. You can see that the pH tends to drop down. The other factor that affects the rhizosphere pH is the nitrogen form. We know that when the ammonium nitrogen is present at higher concentrations, the reaction tends to be strongly acidic. When there's more nitrate, it tends to be more in the basic or doesn't change the pH. Urea, it's there, it's weakly acid, but urea is something that we don't use in hydroponics. So just to explain why this ammonium has an acid reaction, here what you can see is that when you think about plants like to keep a balance of charges, right? So plants really can't function unless the charge balance is achieved. So when a plant uptakes a positive charge, they will extrude another positive charge to keep the balance charge balanced. So what happens is the more hydrogen ions, the lower the pH. The other thing is that when we have ammonium in the solution, even if the plants are not active, there's nitrification by microorganisms, and in the process, ammonium turns into nitrate, and this in the process releases, again, hydrogen protons, which are acid. So the result is that the pH goes down. If we compare that to nitrate, again, the plants are trying to balance their charges. They uptake a negative charge, and they will extrude negative charges. So the pH will go up, because what we're looking at the base, like carbonates and hydroxyls, they are bases. However, nitrate doesn't always necessarily change the pH, and that's why it's the preferred form in hydroponics. Because if the plant uptakes nitrate, it might at the same time uptake a positive charge, and then the pH remains the same. The other thing that is very important when we think about nitrogen forms is that ammonium is taken readily by the plant, and it can result in ammonium toxicity. So it's very important that we think about it as a tool, but we keep an eye on not overusing ammonium. So these are examples of fertilizers that we use for container-grown production of ornamentals, but I just wanted to show it to you as an example on how you can read your labels. So fertilizers like 2177, they have the total amount of nitrogen in the form of ammonium and urea, and therefore it's a very strong acid fertilizer. It's one that you have to be very careful to use because it's going to react very strongly, drop the pH very quickly, but you can't use it on a continual basis. We have another option, something like 20-10-20, 40% of nitrogen in the form of ammonium and urea. It's also an acidic reaction, right? If you have something like 17-5-17, which has 20% of the nitrogen, of the total nitrogen in the form of ammonium and urea, you can see that the reaction is neutral. So the rule of thumb is that if you have fertilizers that have more than 20% of nitrogen in the form of ammonium and urea, they tend to have an acid reaction. So keep that in mind as you're reading your labels. Think, okay, this fertilizer has way too much ammonium, right? Because even though I showed you some options of what's commonly used in our industry, there are also other options that I didn't talk about. And And you can use those options too. The salts are the same salts, but you want to make sure that you know how to read that label, right? You don't want to use fertilizer sources that are too high in ammonium. So again, if we go back, this is the way we're going to read our label. In this case, the fertilizers that are used for hydroponics, most of them come 100% in the form of nitrate nitrogen. So we can also use acids to lower the pH. The reaction is very fast. When we try to use criteria for selection, one is price. Citric acid tends to be the most expensive, sulfuric the least expensive of all. So within that range, you can pick the one you use. The big benefit of citric acid is that it doesn't provide additional nutrients, and then it's on the safe side. For the employees. When we look at the other sports in terms of safety, nitric acid tends to be the strongest one. You have to have highly trained workers to make sure they're handling the acids in the right way. So again, consider that with all the acids, you're adding some nutrients. The exception would be citric acid. And citric acid is one of the options that organic growers will use. So going back to the ammonium-based fertilizers. So like I said, ammonium-based fertilizers will help you drop the pH. One of the growers that I work with here, his strategy is he has a water quality with high alkalinity. And what he does is he uses sulfuric acid to lower the pH. And then throughout the season, what he does is that he applies ammonium nitrate. And the reason is ammonium nitrate has 40%, 50% of the nitrogen in the form of ammonia. That sounds like a lot, but it works for him. He has a deep flow system. And what he does is he's replenishing the nitrogen, but he's not providing all the nitrogen in the form of ammonium. But instead of using acid, he's providing nitrogen. There's one webinar that was recorded, I think sometime last year. Chris Curry talked about one of his research where he measured the amount of nitrogen and the difference between nitrogen when you start and when you end, and how much that was left in the nutrient solution. And what he found is that over time, of course, nitrogen is being depleted. Even though you're replenishing your nutrient solution, the overall total nitrogen in the solution is lower. So the strategy that this grower is using seems to be one that's reasonable and that he has managed to use effectively. So that's a good option in case you're trying to feed your plant and lower your pH. So when we look at the strategies of bases to raise the pH, we can see that potassium hydroxide and sodium hydroxide are the gold standards. They both react very fast. Again, we're adding potassium and sodium over time. Again, if you go back and look at Chris's webinar, he also talked a little bit about the potassium levels and how those accumulate over time. The plant still grew well, but just important to keep an eye. So one of the keys for success in hydroponics is to sample and monitor as much as possible. Our recommendation is that you should be sampling and monitoring every day when it comes in terms of pH and EC, because reality is that you need to be adjusting pH and EC at a daily rate. So you can be a very sophisticated grower depending on how big you are and have inline sensors and automatic adjustment, or you can have something going back to the basics and just have a good pH meter that is something you can calibrate and then constantly monitor the pH and EC of the nutrient solution. Again, I don't mean to make you buy expensive equipment, but don't go for the cheapest option. Always buy a meter that's going to last and that it's reliable. And a meter can be very good and very expensive, but if you don't calibrate it, the measurement, it's not a good one. So make sure you buy a good meter, make sure you use it, and make sure you calibrate your meters. So just to summarize, the success for hydroponics comes down to monitoring and acting based on numbers. The changes that we see in hydroponics when it comes to pH are daily, so you want to monitor those every day, and you want to make changes of pH every day. You want to make sure that you not only do in-house monitoring, but every once in a while you want to make sure that you're on target, especially when you're starting. You want to send complete nutrient analysis by getting it from a commercial lab. And at first, and again, some of the most successful growers, if they're really large, they will be doing that on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. So with these, we're going to talk about tomatoes and cucumbers. When we think about tomatoes and cucumbers, the general requirements are, of course, very different than what we looked in growing herbs and lettuce. The levels of elements are much larger than what we just talked about. And one of the big things that we need to look into that we don't pay much attention when we're growing herbs and lettuce is the potassium and nitrogen ratio. The reason is because that potassium is going to help fill up the fruit. You want a harder fruit, you increase your potassium. You want, so that's the biggest difference when you're growing a crop that's going to result in fruit levels. So I'm going to give you an example of tomatoes, of a tomato nutrient program, but I'll give you also a link on where you can find more information of different options of programs and also options to grow cucumber. So the first thing is to look at tomato production has 3 growth stages, which are very well marked. So you have a vegetative stage, and that is anything that happens before the first flower. And you can see that at this rate, you want to have a potassium nitrate level that's close to 1:1. When you have the first cluster of flowers, all the way up to the 4th cluster of flowers, you are increasing your potassium level to 1.5 to 1. And then when the plants are starting to mature, from fruit to ripening, again, going beyond the 4th cluster, you're going to increase even more that potassium levels. At any time, if you think you don't have enough leaves, the trick is in increasing the nitrogen proportion, especially in the ammonium form. Again, ammonium is a good tool, but you can't overuse it. So the rule of thumb is you never want to apply more than 10% of your nitrogen in the form of ammonium. We're going to see some examples as well. So here we see the example of nutrient solutions that are used to grow tomatoes from transplant to the first flower. Again, as a base fertilizer, there's an option to use the 5-11-26, the same we use with lettuce. Again, we use the same calcium nitrate, but the rates that we're using are slightly different and a little bit higher than what we used for lettuce. If we use these rates at these doses, what we see is that we have a potassium to nitrate ratio of 1 to 1.2, and the plants grow really well. Then we move to the second stage, 1st to 4th cluster. We have, again, the same stock solution starting with the fertilizer 5-11-26 as our base fertilizer, but now we're going to start including the potassium nitrate just to raise those potassium levels, right? Again, when we look at the potassium nitrate ratio, you can see the levels of potassium go a little bit up. And then when we go to the 4th cluster, you can see that the 4th cluster and beyond, you're going to be adding the same baseline. You're going to add some magnesium sulfate, iron chelate, and then again, you're adding your calcium nitrate and potassium nitrate, okay? So again, that's just one of the example of fertilizer solutions, and these were developed by Dr. Rich McAvoy, who's our department head here in the University of Connecticut. He has worked for many years with some of our growers. And there are other options that growers use, and again, it's very important for you guys to read the labels. For example, if you look at the solution in stock A that some of the growers here use, the big problem is that there is 44% of nitrogen in the form of ammonium. And then this turns out to an equivalent of 70% of ammonium in the form of nitrogen. So what that means is that you're flushing and putting too much growth. And if you keep that at a consistent rate, you're going to be reducing the amount of fruit you get. So you never want to overuse the ammonium nitrate. Now, the other thing that's important when we think about vine crops is that we have, again, with this different in vegetative versus production stage. So vegetative, you have higher nitrogen levels. During your production stage, you increase your potassium, as we mentioned earlier. The other thing is you want to promote, like I mentioned earlier, if you want to promote vegetation growth, you just increase the ammonium form. The other thing that's very interesting, it's very different than what we do in other crops, is that we have to adjust the electrical conductivity by season. In the spring and the fall, here in the Northeast, we can see that the plants are uptaking much less water, right? So you increase the electrical conductivity, so the same amount of nutrients are delivered. It's kind of counterintuitive because we tend to decrease the electrical conductivity or reduce nutrition during the cold months. But in this case, what we do is the opposite, because both of these plants, both tomatoes and cucumbers, are very strong feeders. So you want to feed them enough. Because they are not uptaking enough volume of water, you increase the electrical conductivity. And then you do the opposite during the warm months. During the summer, you're going to decrease the electrical conductivity because the water volume that's being uptaken, it's much larger. So you don't want the leaves to burn. And again, these are recommendations based on a lot of Dr. McAvoy's experience, and all of the tomato growers here in Connecticut follow his recommendations. And this is how they have achieved a very good growth. So I went very fast talking about what are the options for vine crops, and like I said, there are many more options on how you can start with a different fertilizer base. What you can do is go to ipm.uconn.edu, you click under greenhouse, you click under edible crops, and then there's a little link that will talk about greenhouse tomatoes, a few online sources for you. And if you go there, you will get more detailed tables, more options on how to develop your own nutrition program. So one of the things about growing a crop like tomato, we didn't talk about pH, but the optimum pH for a tomato crop is going to be between 5.5 and 6.0. Typically, we don't bother very much on adjusting the pH of the nutrient solution for tomatoes unless we go into the extremes. So if you have a pH like around 7, because that's most likely coming from your water, then it's when you would think about adjusting the pH to take it within that range. But other than that, tomatoes seem to be very effective on uptaking nutrients, and they work well under this range of pH. So one of the questions I always get for hydroponics is, how about organic fertilizers? So what you see here on the left and on the right, we were not using organic fertilizers, but we were using different types of organic amendments. And one of the issues that we find with organic amendments is that they're very good at clogging the system. Actually, one of the areas that I work on is biofilm, and the way we enhance biofilm formation in our pipes to conduct our research is by putting organic fertilizers. So that's one of the big limitations with organic fertilizers. It has a higher risk of clogging. Many of the growers that I work with, they have tested organic-based fertilizers, organic certified fertilizers, and they drop it after a couple of days because the clogging is just something that's not manageable. The other thing that we have a couple of issues with organic fertilizers is that we don't know very well the nutrient release curves of those fertilizers. So it's very hard for us to predict when to use those fertilizers and when those nutrients will be released from the organic part of the fertilizers. So hopefully we'll get to a point where those fertilizers are working well for our system, but at this point it's something we can't count on. And then the other thing is just talk to you about other e-Gro resources regarding nutrition, hydroponic vegetables. One is our colleague Beth from Ohio State. She developed an edible alert on disease or disorder, common issues in greenhouse tomatoes production. Very good one. Neil Madsen developed one in iron deficiency of hydroponic leafy greens and herbs. And then at the research portion, you will find something on symptoms of common nutrient deficiencies in hydroponic basil. And with that, I'd love to take questions. We have a lot of time. So are there any questions, Brian?